So, good morning, everyone. My name is Jason Palich. I am the Executive Director of the 495 MetroWest Partnership. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this morning's session of our Water Resources Committee. In just a moment, I'll introduce today's presentation, but first, a few housekeeping items. Just all attendees are muted upon their entry into today's meeting. You do have the ability to unmute yourselves. Please remain muted while our presenter is speaking, but afterwards for Q&A, folks will have the opportunity to unmute themselves. Today's presentation is being recorded for later posting on our YouTube page as well as our website. Following the presentation, our presenter is happy to take a few questions. We invite folks to do so using either the raise hand function. We're also a small group this morning, so folks can also unmute themselves as they're able to do so. If you're experiencing any technical issues, you can shoot me an email at jason@495partnership.org. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to the private sector co-chair of our Water Resources Committee, Dan Feeney of Beals and Thomas, to introduce our presentation this morning. So go ahead, Dan Feeney.
Great. Thanks, Jason. We are pleased to be joined this morning by a representative of the Sudbury Valley Trustees. Sudbury Valley Trustees works to protect natural areas and farmland for wildlife and people in the 36 communities that surround the Sudbury, Assabet, and Concord Rivers. 25 of the 36 communities served by SVT are also located in the 495 MetroWest Partnership service area. Today, we will hear from SVT regarding their recent land protection prioritization work. To guide regional land protection strategies, Sudbury Valley Trustees has worked with the MetroWest Conservation Alliance to develop a tool that identifies those lands that are the most essential to conserve in the region around the Sudbury, Assabet, and Concord Rivers. Because the tool can identify priority areas at the boundaries of towns, it is also intended to facilitate collaboration and conservation partnerships. Our presenter this morning is Dan Stimson, who serves as the Assistant Director of the Stewardship for SVT. So with that, I will turn it over to Dan.
Thanks very much, Dan, and thanks for having me today. And so I will walk through a presentation of the project that Dan just described, and then I think we'll have time and we'll be able to kind of walk through the tool itself and get a kind of a real world look at how it works. So as was mentioned, this was a project to identify land protection priorities in our service area, which does have a lot of overlap with yours. We worked on this primarily in 2022 and have launched just last fall and are introducing it to towns and organizations like yourself right now. So as Dan said, we're a regional land trust. We protect land between Boston and Worcester in those 36 towns that make up the Suwasco watershed. And so here's a look to see the overlap with your organization here. And so the 495 belt is out on the western edge of our communities, and we work in the 36 towns that contribute to the watershed. So SVT internally had our own land protection prioritization plan that we conducted in 2014, but it was clearly time for an update. We have added a lot of different land protection tools in GIS that are available to us now, and we wanted to work those in. So they include a lot more data for climate planning and planning for protection of land protection to help with climate change. But we've also seen a greater need for working equity into our work, and so that is one of the key components of this tool as well. But also I mentioned that in 2014, it was really an internal tool that we had created, and we wanted to take a much more collaborative approach this time. And so that was kind of key to how we started off, and I'll describe how that worked. We sought out funding for this. It was going to be a pretty big effort. So we were awarded funding both from the Suwasco Wild and Scenic River Stewardship Council and a great grant program by the it's called the 2021 Land and Climate Program. It's administered by LTA, the Land Trust Alliance, which is a national organization that supports land trust work, and was coupled with technical support from the Open Space Institute, who has a lot of really great on-the-ground, real-world experience with using a lot of the data sets that we have integrated into this new tool. So that was really helpful in kind of seeing what was available, but also making that part of the tool. So to get that collaborative approach, we coordinated a working group through the Regional Conservation Partnership known as the MetroWest Conservation Alliance, or MCA, if you might see on our website. So SPT is one of the guiding organizations in the MCA, and we help organize those regional meetings to look at issues like this land protection prioritization. So with MCA, we developed a survey of the members of that group, but also SPT members, and also encouraged other groups that were part of the MCA to share with their membership. And we wanted to look at what some of the priorities were for including in this plan. And so back in 2014, our land protection priorities focused mainly on habitat, with some additional work we did in 2016 to include some farmland preservation. And we knew we wanted to broaden that scope for this plan. And so we wanted to find out what all of these organizations really had for priorities for protection. After looking at the survey results, it was really nicely working itself into these four main themes, which I have listed here, which we're calling natural services, habitat for biodiversity, community conservation, and farmland. And so I'll talk about what each of those are and the data sets that they include. So first off, natural services. We looked at carbon storage, which was totally new for us. So there are some great data sets that are actually being updated now. So this is, I'm hoping, going to be able to be something that we can dynamically introduce into this data viewer as updates come. But this carbon storage data lets us look at which forests can provide the most carbon storage, both for a period of about 50 years into the future. And so it's projected data that was led by a study that was done by Clark University. We're also looking at connecting core habitats for biodiversity. So the Habitat for Biodiversity grouping that we'll look at later focuses on those big sections that are really the best for biodiversity, but we also know that species need to move between those. And so this natural services grouping focuses a lot on connections to those blocks. Protection of water quality was really a main theme from the survey results. And so that has actually worked its way into a few of these different categories to represent that really shared focus by a lot of these groups. And also protection of flood storage capacity. And so, you know, as climate change presents us with more challenges, this has been one that communities are seeing really in the forefront already. And so we took a look at that for this natural services group. This Habitat for Biodiversity layer is rather similar to the work that we did in 2014, although there have been some really significant updates, as well as some progress on dealing with climate change. So it focuses really on those significant blocks of habitat, areas of uninterrupted interior forests that are great for species that need those uninterrupted blocks for, you know, in the case of birds, it's interior nesting habitat. But a lot of species actually need that buffer from highways and from development as well. We're also looking at priority natural communities, which is a designation by Natural Heritage, as well as some underrepresented natural communities, which was taken from some work by Mass Audubon, in which they surveyed all of the conservation land in our state and looked at what natural communities were represented in those protected lands. And so with that tool, you can look at what natural communities are not well represented in those lands and trying to protect those to have a better suite of natural communities in the whole conservation portfolio. So that was a really good addition in this one as well. And of course, we're looking at rare and endangered species habitat. Those migration corridors that I talked about in natural services, this is kind of on a bigger scale as well, allowing species to move as climate change comes. So especially from south to north, to make sure that species can migrate to adjust to changing conditions. And climate resiliency in general, kind of looking at the land, not only as the grouping of species that are there now, but also as a stage that can be dynamic and still function in the future based on whatever happens with climate change. So looking at the most resilient sites to support habitat that's there now, but also in the future. Community conservation was an exciting addition. I think that it's going to be a really cool addition to SVT's work, and I'm hoping some other towns as well. We're looking here for this one at smaller, minimally disturbed natural areas, so not necessarily those big blocks of habitat. It's kind of important to think, though, that that Habitat for Biodiversity talks about habitat as the main focus, but all of these other buckets kind of serve habitat as well. So, your 5 to 10 acre parcel in a more developed area is still really important for a lot of different species. And so all of these are serving that habitat need as well. And so this one looks at some of those smaller, less disturbed natural areas that can be in context of not so much protected land already. This one especially gives weighting to environmental justice areas for any of the criteria that are defined in that program. And about accessing open space. So we looked at access points for regional trail links like the Bay Circuit Trail, any of the great rail trails that we have in our region, as well as some of the other longer distance. So we have the Burroughs Loop Trail in the Four Boroughs community as well. So looking at additional access points to those regional trail links that would also serve to connect them if there are breaks in them currently. And about access points to existing preserved land. So you might have a conservation area in your community that doesn't have a great trailhead or legal access from a road. And so we're looking at places that could improve that. Areas in and around severe summer heat is a really new one for us as well. But so we looked at temperature data and looked at areas that would protect lands around those heat islands in more developed areas of some of our cities and towns. And again, I mentioned that water quality and flood storage was a real focus highlight point of the survey. And so we worked those into this data as well, because this kind of focus area is looking at these minimally disturbed but smaller areas. And so these water quality and flood storage points that the model will build on top of those. And so we'll see some of those come up a little bit higher in the scoring on this community level, as opposed to the natural services, which might look at them more in terms of some of the better scoring in general. And so this is kind of focused more on those environmental justice areas, centers of cities, and things like that. And finally, farmland. Farmland is a pretty simple model in this example. So we did a lot of work in 2016, as I mentioned, to include farmland in SVT's priorities work. And that was through a lot of speaking with individual communities, looking at open space plans and pulling out individual parcels from that knowledge, and also from land cover analysis. And that was one of the biggest updates that's changed in those 7 or 8 years. That data has been updated. So we have new land cover analysis that we're able to look at again and apply filters for potential farmland, but also existing farmland. And then of course, the designated prime farmland soils were taken into account as well. So all of this work was done through GIS. It's a really powerful tool where you can look at all of these data sets, combine them, compare them, and do a lot of analyses. And so here's a look at the data sets that we gathered for each of those themes. So you can see that we used 8 for natural services, 13 for habitat for biodiversity, 11 for community conservation, and just those 3 data sets for farmland. But I'll stress again, this was a really great place to have the Open Space Institute's real world experience, and especially for larger regional data sets that were focused on the Northeast or the East and are not as local. We benefited a lot from their knowledge of what would work best for this. So in that GIS analysis, we were able to take all of those data sets, assign scoring to features in the data sets, and weight those data sets based on the feedback from the survey. So I've mentioned a couple times that those water resources weighed really heavily in the survey. And so we were able to give those more weight in the calculations that GIS did to reinforce that priority in the survey. So the survey, this is a little wonky, but we're looking at rasters. And so every square foot of our watershed was taken into account. We broke all of the data into these 30 meter by 30 meter grids, which are a pretty common size for data analysis. And so we converted all of that data to this format so that they would work well together. And then used a function in GIS called weighted sum, where basically it takes the score of all of those individual pixels of 30 by 30 and adds them together. So I'll show you an example of how the farmland worked, but if you can think of having those 8 or 13 data sets all on top of each other with every pixel receiving a score, and you're adding up where they align geographically. And then we used some zonal statistics to summarize those values to ownership parcels. So our initial feedback, which you'll see in the tool, really goes down to real features on the land, and it's not relevant basic to, it's not directly related to ownership parcels. And we know that in the real world, you work with owners to protect land or to develop land. And so we use statistics to summarize the values within those ownership parcels, so you could look at them on a parcel basis as well. So this is kind of a quick and dirty visual of how that scoring worked. So we ranked all of those individual data sets on a score from 0 to 5. So some were just presence absence. So if it didn't have it, it was a 0. And if that value was there, it was a 5. Whereas some of them, for example, the prime farmland soils in this example here had multiple values. And so we had a 0, a 3, and a 5. And so we added those, and this is the farmland is kind of a nice way to look at it because there are only those 3 inputs. And so you can see where each of those lay on the land, and if they overlapped, then the score increased. And so you're looking at the resulting map here down on the bottom of a score of 0 to 15 based on the combination of those 3 mappings. And we're able to display those, which you'll see in the data viewer, on a color ramp from basically yellow to a deeper green. So the highest values score and show as a deep green, and the lower values show as a light green. And this graphic gives you an idea of how it broke down for all 4 of those focus areas. So the one we just looked at, farmland, is on the bottom right, and the other 3 are there as well. And you can pick out some real trends, right? Especially for the Habitat for Biodiversity, where you can see those really dark greens kind of fall within those areas. I should say these 4 maps are independent of ownership. So conserved lands are incorporated in these. So obviously in the habitat layers, big blocks of conserved areas are scoring really well because they're providing really excellent habitat. But that allows us to look at those parcels that are around the perimeter of those blocks of conservation land, which obviously add a lot to the value of those areas as well. And so the natural services, you can see, I think probably indications of waterways here as well, which added a lot to the scoring. Those are really important in a lot of the data sets that we use. And as you might imagine, the community conservation is more broken up because it's kind of looking at it at a finer scale and considering things that are important to communities. And so some of these are straighter lines. So you can see access to rail trails is one of the things that drives that as well. So we knew we needed to communicate this for it to be effective. And so one of the ways that we did that was to create this story map, which is hosted on our webpage and allows you to go through and learn all about our project, learn the kind of the process we took through the survey and why it's important to include all of the data sets we have included. So this kind of will lead to these 4 data viewers, which you can see here, the community conservation. And because we do have a smallish group, we'll be able to actually look through these after this presentation and kind of dive directly into some of these areas. But this is how the landing page for one of those 4 data viewers looks. So you can see over on the left, we've added in a mask for protected open space so that you can kind of see that those are off the table. And then we've given you the color ramp of the scoring for that model, as well as the town boundaries, so you can look at just your town if that's what you're interested in. I would say, though, that one of the key things about this is the ability to look beyond those town boundaries. And so it allows both the scoring of your parcels within your town, but also the viewing of priorities over that boundary as well to see how it works in the context regionally. And you can get down on a fine level, and when you do zoom in close enough, the parcels will appear, and so you can select a parcel, and it will give you the average model score for that parcel. So you can see here, this parcel that we've looked at has some really high scoring, darker greens around here, but this area here didn't score so well. So it takes the average of every single one of those 30 by 30 meter pixels within that parcel and gives you that average score up front. And then, because that average score is a model based on all of those other inputs, this community conservation, I forget exactly how many this one had, but we give you all of the individual points for each of those component data sets as well. So if you have a focus that might not align directly with all of these, you could look particularly at what the data sets that are most important to you scored. And it gives you obviously some of the location and address info, how large the data is, the lot is, and things like that. So next steps with this data viewer, we built this tool, as I mentioned, in a partnership with MCA, and so it's very intentionally able to be used broadly and not necessarily specific to an individual organization like Sudbury Valley Trustees needs. And so we're currently working on using this tool to develop our own organizational priorities and figuring out which parcels of all of these that we're showing in the scoring are most important to us and how we'll work with landowners to try and protect those. But we're also working with those individual partners to introduce this tool to them and show them how to utilize it and use this data for their priorities. And so I've been speaking with some towns who are going through updates to their open space plan on how they might incorporate this tool into their planning. And so that has been really helpful to gather the feedback from those towns and organizations who have jumped in and started using this already. And so one of the things we're hearing is that it would be really helpful to be able to view parcels compared to each other, not necessarily all the natural features within it. So we've just added some additional functionality to the tool that I can show you that will show you that model score for every parcel ranked against each other on a parcel level. So it will show you, instead of those natural features on a color ramp of white to dark green, it will show you parcel ownerships on that same scale. And so you can look at where a bunch of really valuable parcels are lumped together, like in here with the darker greens and the medium greens as well. And so basically that's transitioning from these really specific areas to a parcel result. And I should thank again our funders for this project, and especially the MetroWest Conservation Alliance, who put in a lot of work with us in moving this from kind of an idea to a tool that we hope is functioning for everybody to use. So do you want to, we could do questions, or we could jump right into the tool?
I'd love to take questions if folks have them, Dan, but I'm wondering maybe if we can pick one of our communities that's fully encapsulated in your service area, because a lot are picked, and I'd love to do some detail. I am looking, and obviously Dan Feeney is with Beals and Thomas, which is headquartered in Southborough. Southborough is one of our communities that's fully encapsulated in your service area. What about taking a look at Southborough?
Absolutely, yeah.
Which I know also has a lot of wonderful natural resources.
Yeah. So first I'll share kind of where this tool is. So if you go to sbtweb.org, under our work, you'll find a link down here, the story map, conservation in the Swasco. So if you click on that, you'll get a description of what this is. One thing I haven't talked about yet is kind of process and documentation. And there's a report here, it's a PDF that goes into really fine detail about what every single one of those individual data sets is. It will give you a link on the web if there is a website representing that data set where you can learn more about it. It'll tell you the last time that data was updated. It also gives you the individual scoring breakdown that we assign to all of the values within that individual data set. So if you really want to jump in and understand how it is that these scoring are developed, I would definitely take a look at this PDF. You can also then link to the story map itself, which will again give you that full introduction to the project in kind of an interactive way. It shows you a lot of imagery that represents the data sets that we're looking at and why it is that certain ones of those are important. Some of the, we're going to get into some pretty data heavy pages here when we go into Southborough, and it might load a little slowly because I'm at home and doing Zoom and loading this data at the same time, but let's give it a shot. So are you curious about any one of these in particular for Southborough?
What about community conservation, actually? Because one of the things we focused on with our transportation resources is access and connection to trails. And I think is a feature that's pretty interesting for a lot of our stakeholders. Perfect.
Yeah. So when you jump in, the data will load. We're looking at the full region here. And so as we zoom down to Southborough, the resolution will take a little bit to come in here, but you'll start to see already some separation in the data. I will say that there is one thing to realize is that we're reliant on data that's submitted to MassGIS, especially for the protection status. So for instance, you can see here that this portion of the Sudbury Reservoir isn't showing up as protected, where I'm pretty sure it must be. And so if MassGIS doesn't have the open space data, it wouldn't be reflected on here. And so that is, that's an extra plea if you're working in a community and protecting land to get that data to MassGIS, because it's really helpful for planners and for planning in general. And so I'm kind of seeing, we've got these blocks of open space here. I'm seeing a really dark green here, some dark green around the Route 9. And some up
actually, Dan, if I could just cut in and ask, so if you could talk a little bit, so one of the things with Southborough is, as opposed to some of our other communities, is a substantial portion of Southborough's land mass is bodies of water. Can you talk a little bit, just briefly, for someone using the tool, about how bodies of water are represented? Because it almost looks as if some of the dark green actually is portions of the reservoir.
Yeah, when you get to a certain scale, those reservoirs will show up, and so those will mask over those, but they are really valuable for a lot of these functions. And so as I said, the tool calculated every square foot of the town, so those are scoring well. But when you get into this fine level where the parcels show up, the water will mask over those, so you don't have to consider those if you don't want to. And obviously it had a lot to do with the scoring. So community conservation, if you were to go back into that PDF and look at, there were flood storage and other scores. And if we go in and look at an individual parcel, maybe we'll come into this one here. And so you can click to receive the results here. And so this one scored as an average of 20.5. And so the water ones scoring in particular, we looked at outstanding resource waters, public water supply protection, surface water protection. This Conserve for inland flood resilience is a Nature Conservancy data set that looks at all of the parcels and will tell you how important it is to protect that for flood resilience. And then you can see the other factors that are less directly related to water here as well. The interesting thing, so there's a little bit different functionality. So you can click on an individual parcel and you're going to get the average model score, but you're also going to get where is it here? The pixel score. So this exact 30 by 30 meter pixel that I clicked on was a 25, and that contributes to the 20.5. And that enables you to look at this parcel as a whole and say, well, which portions of this parcel are most valuable and why? And so you could click over here and the average is going to stay the same, but you're going to see that this particular pixel didn't have any of those value points. And so if we back up a little bit, as well as these natural features, you can go in to that new feature that I mentioned over here in the layers set, and you can turn on the parcel symbology. And that might be a little bit easier for a lot of planners to look at because it's ranking those parcels against each other in a parcel as a whole. And so this is a pretty data heavy view, so we can't enable it for the whole watershed. So we've tried to do it with kind of the average size of a town. So you should be able to back up on pretty much the whole town-wide scale and see those darker greens start to show up on a parcel by parcel basis as well. And you can still go about doing the same clicking for score and getting that same data set. It's just a different way to visualize that average score.
And Dan, just to clarify, the intensity of the green color here, is that specifically the community conservation score, or is that across categories?
Specifically community conservation. So that's another thing that we get asked a lot is, do we have anywhere that looks at where all 4 of those are combined and we get 1 score? And we don't. There are things within each that are considered within each, and we think that adding them up together would kind of give too much weight to those factors. And so right now, it's really you can look at the 4 individually and see which ones are kind of meeting your focus area. So this viewer is simply the community conservation.
So you can't, we don't enable folks to skip all the way to the end of the storybook, so to speak, and get a summary judgment.
That's right. But so the one thing I am doing though is working with, so I mentioned we're talking with towns that are doing their open space plans. And I'm happy to share the underlying GIS data with anybody with GIS capabilities so that they could do whatever they want with that data. And so some of the towns I think are looking at ways that they can combine the 4. So you can see this one has, you know, these areas that are showing up really well. This is our Turin wildlife habitat over here off of Oak Hill Road, and there's some valuable lands adjacent to that. This nice one next to Chestnut Hill Farm, and down here against the Beals Preserve that Salk manages. And again, this is just one of the 4, so you could call up any of the other 3 to look at how those different values scored as well.
And Dan, apologies because this is a hyper-specific question, but I'm curious, and I think that the answer is yes. But so trails, obviously, again, as I mentioned, you know, for community conservation is something that we're particularly interested in as a feature for folks. Do your maps, to what extent do your maps have trails actually overlaid on them? And I'm looking, I know that there's the trail along the northeastern portion of the Sudbury Reservoir in Southburn. It looks to me like there might be a white line indicating that trail.
That's a remnant of the base map. So we haven't, or it might be part of the roads. We haven't intentionally added trails as a viewable feature on here. That is something we haven't heard yet, but we could do. And so it's more that it is factored into the scoring of the data sets. It's not something that we're presenting as a visualization here with the tool.
Okay.
So just following up on that, if I may, if you're sharing the information with towns and the towns have pretty good maps of trails in the town, like Northborough where I live, would the town planner be able to sort of layer the trail map onto one of your maps?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I have, just for transparency's sake, I should mention that I'm clerk at Sudbury Valley Trustees. So I'm very interested in, for a lot of reasons, in this presentation. But do you mind if I ask some more questions?
Please.
Go right ahead, Peter.
I have a whole bunch of questions.
I've got a battery of questions myself, Peter.
Okay.
Let's break up me talking. You go ahead.
All right. Well, just a couple to start. Dan, you had mentioned underrepresented natural communities. Can you give an example of what such an underrepresented natural community would be?
Pitch pine scrub oak forest, I suspect, or I don't know. So, for instance, it looks at on a statewide layer, it's going to look at salt marshes, those pitch pine scrub oak forests, other natural communities, and telling you whether or not the catalog of open space contains a good representation of those. And so I don't have all of the individual communities off the top of my head, but I suspect pitch pine scrub oak forest, which we're doing some work with at Memorial Forest, is one of them. It could be a successional forest, so a forest that is kind of shrubby and scrubby in between a field and a mature forest, I suspect are not well represented in conservation land. And so it's looking at those that are not protected as much, and that probably in turn have species that rely on them that are struggling because they don't have that protection.
So I guess I'm trying to get the concept of underrepresentation in my mind. Does it mean that it's valued habitats that, as a matter of percentage of acreage, is not as protected as other valued habitats?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And in terms of the heat islands, does this tool help a more urban municipality like Marlborough to identify specific parcels that are heat islands?
Not specifically, because they are just one of the factoring pieces within all of these. That data is available individually so that they could look at specifically heat islands, but you can see that the heat severity and the heat severity adjacency. So the heat severity is taken directly from those heat islands, which data is available for, that shows you where, you know, parking lots and a lot of blacktop exist that have much above average heat scores in the summer. So we looked at specifically those blocks, but we also created our own data set that's adjacency, and did, I think it was 100 to 500 meters, that the specific numbers are in that process document, but kind of acknowledging that those places are probably pretty open to development to just spread those. And so looking at those buffers of those heat areas, that preventing any further impervious surfaces, you know, by the protection of the land could result in that not growing any further. And so we felt that scoring for both of those would be important to show protection opportunities next to those already very hot properties. So you can't look at this data and get specifically which ones are a direct result of the heat adjacency, but that data set is available in GIS if you wanted to specifically look at that.
Right, and sort of following up on that as well, when you described the methodology, you said that there's a weighting of various factors initially. If the GIS data is made available to municipalities, could they apply their own weighting to the data and generate their own sort of custom maps?
They could. It was a pretty lengthy process to do all of the analyses, but theoretically, yeah, you could. And so, for instance, the weighting, it gives you, if you do the drop down, that this score was doubled in the final model score because that was looked at as one of the high areas of concern in the survey, whereas that one did too. So for this one, actually, it was a little complicated. We did a lot of the doubling for this, but so aquifers were not doubled. So you can get an idea of which ones had that increased weighting, which is also given in table form in the process documentation.
All right, my last question, at least for now, is this, and that is, we've heard something about the municipal vulnerability grant program run by the state. Is how would this data assist a town or a municipality in dealing with that program?
Very well. So, you know, I haven't mentioned already, but Krista Collins was our director of stewardship our director of land protection when we were working on this, and she worked with SVT for a long time and was really key driver in kind of coming up with these priorities. And that was a grant funding mechanism that she worked with on a daily basis for doing land protection. And so that was always top of her mind, to be looking at, you know, how can we integrate these data sets that translate to real world funding opportunities and concerns on state and regional levels. And so that resiliency for inland flood resilience score would directly relate to one of the main MVP goals of reducing flooding, water quality, and a lot of the other components in this speak a lot to the priorities of the MVP program. And so each of these different 4 analyses have pieces that come from that and from other funding programs. So you could speak to, if you're looking to fund the protection of a parcel over here, you would be able to see how it scored in those individual focus areas that relate to grant programs that you're working with.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for mentioning the MVP program, because that's, of course, one of our priorities is increased investment to MVP. All 36 of our cities and towns, I'm excited to say, have done the planning grant, but of course, there's a lot of work to be done with the action grants that still include some planning activities. So Dan, a question, and I apologize for how wonky this is going to be, but I'm curious as to some of the methodology undergirding the scoring. And maybe as an example, I'll pick public water supply. So public water supply is something that the partnership is interested not only to protect, obviously, the region's natural resources, but also for quality of life and for economic development as well. We know for economic development purposes, water and sewer capacity is an essential component. Wondering if you might be able to dive in when you look at scoring for public water supply protection. What goes into that? Was that something you made internally? Is there sort of an external data set you point to determine what meets that? So I'm wondering if you could just I'll stop failing to form the sentence properly and just have you explain it.
Yeah, no, I got it. So that's laid out in this documentation report, and so you can see it talks about the GIS process, and then it breaks it into those 4 focus areas. So public water supply protection zones were a factor in natural services, and so in this table, you can see the source is from MassGIS. So that, I think, comes from probably DEP to MassGIS. And within that MassGIS data set, it will give you Zone 1, Zone 2, and Zone 3 of those inland water protection areas designations for every parcel. And so in this example, we gave 1 point to Zone 3s, 3 points to Zone 2s, and 5 points to Zone 1s. And you can see this one had a single weight, whereas, for example, the carbon sequestration had a 2 for a multiplier for this data set. And then if you want some extra detail about really what are Zone 1, Zone 2, and Zone 3, you can come down here and you can click through a link, and this will bring you to MassGIS's landing page for that data set, where they actually speak to how it was that they defined those Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 3s, who curates the data, who updates it, and everything like that.
Thank you for that. So there is some existing DEP work reflected in here. There's something that, in other words, for somebody who's looking at this from an economic development perspective, who knows their community pretty well, this isn't necessarily so much new information as much as in some cases better presenting that information.
That's really it. Yeah. So in only a couple cases, like I mentioned, that adjacency to heat are data sets that SVT did some work to create. The rest is really pulling together all of those really well-trusted existing data sources that are available through MassGIS that are from DEP or Natural Heritage, and just looking at them in comparison to each other and really seeing where they overlap to kind of see the best bang for your buck to be able to combine as many of those values as possible.
Thank you. And sort of my last question before, see if there's any others, and then maybe some wrap up for you, Dan, as to how folks can engage with this project a little bit better is, I'm curious about your process to choose your 4 categories. And I recognize that, again, for a lot of our economic development focused municipal officials, I think that sort of summary judgment that blends all 4 categories together and says, don't develop here, develop here is interesting. But obviously there's different buckets that don't necessarily, that are important to consider unto themselves. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about your process of how you chose the 4 higher level categories that parcels are broken into, because you referenced that some are pre-existing and some are a little bit new.
Yeah. It was kind of looking at all of, so we did that survey and got the results and saw what people were really valuing. And as a committee with the MCA and with help from OSI, we really just did our best to try and group those into complementary data sets that would look to focus on areas that really seem to go together. And so I think I mentioned before, you can see that some of those water protection zones are in 2 areas because they really kind of led to that same, they gave input to 2 reasons for conserving lands. And so we took all of those data sets and saw where we thought that they were really complementary and would kind of speak to a theme that somebody could be using to protect land. And so I think it is, like you say, most groups, I think, will probably want to use these in combination with each other. SVT certainly will be. So to give you an idea of the thinking that we're looking at now, we're kind of looking at when you look at that color ramp from the lightest green to the darkest green, we're looking at taking out the darkest green from each of those and combining probably those 4 to see areas especially that overlap. So if one parcel is well represented in the top scoring portion for both natural services and habitat for biodiversity, for instance, then it would be kind of a no-brainer to look really closely at that parcel, but also in conjunction with each other to see if those build larger blocks of focus areas where we could kind of look more regionally. So it was fairly subjective to kind of answer your question. We looked at it as a committee and tried to do our best to combine like features that would kind of result in a theme that could work well for conservation groups to look at protection.
Thank you. And Dan, sort of a kind of a wrap-up question for you in sort of 2 parts is, you know, obviously we've had the good fortune to have you walk us through this process. I'm wondering if you might be able to, from the perspective of either, you know, somebody who's working for their city or town, or even a member of the public, if you can explain to them, you know, from the sort of the starting point, how they might engage with this tool. And then further, if you want to maybe talk about how folks could get in touch with you and SVT, if there's something they're interested in drilling down a little bit more on.
Absolutely. So we didn't spend very much time at all looking at the story map, but that is really goes through in a narrative story, basically what I discussed in my presentation. So that is a really good introduction, we hope, to this project and to why we valued certain areas and how we think it can be best used. And each of these 4 data viewers are actually included within that story map. So as you progress through the story, you can actually look through the data as you're making your way through that story map. So the link to the story map, as well as those 4 data viewers, are available on our website. So if you go to svtweb.org and look under our work, you can see the story map and the conservation in the Suasco project and find all of those different landing pages. And I would say if you're just starting fresh, I would definitely read through that story map and see kind of where we came from to present this data, and then look through the data sets themselves. My contact is right there on SVT's webpage. It's also at the end of that process document. If you go through that and have questions about that, you can definitely reach out, email me anytime, and I'm happy to help. So, you know, as I mentioned, the collaboration was one of the key driving forces for this project, and we spent a lot of time and want to make sure that it's getting used. So I'm really totally happy trying to help get this out further if people have specific questions.
Well, excellent. Well, Dan, I want to thank you for your time. We're going to go ahead and close out the recording from this morning's session, but I want to thank all of our stakeholders for engaging with this presentation. We will be putting follow-up materials on our website at 495partnership.org and encouraging our stakeholders who are not already on our email list to visit the contact us section of our website to sign up to join our email list so that they can be kept up to speed on future events. So with that, I'm going to close out the recording, and I want to, on behalf of the 495 MetroWest Partnership, thank Dan and thank everyone for attending this morning.
Thanks very much, Dan. Appreciate it.